SDG tent virtually. A warm welcome to you all for our very important conversation today entitled Tackling the Triple Threat of Food Security, Economic and Climate Crises by Building Climate Resilient Food Systems. This important session is hosted by Royal DSM with support of all the SDG tent partners. Now, usually we would gather in person at the Sustainable Development Goals tent in Davos during the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. It's an impartial and open space where ideas, thought leadership, and unhindered dialogue flourishes. But this year it is, of course, different with the COVID pandemic sweeping the world. So you and our speakers are all connecting in from around the world for a virtual SDG tent dialogue. Nevertheless, our goal remains the same: to catalyze the global debate around the role of business and its capacity to deliver sustainable and inclusive development. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Dominic Waughray. I'm a managing director of the World Economic Forum, and I'm very pleased to moderate you through this urgent and inspiring topic and this session today. So, why are we speaking on the topic of tackling the triple threat of food security, economic and climate crises? Sounds quite complicated. What are the threats? Let's try and unpick them a little bit to set the scene. So one of the most complex sets of challenges we face at a global, national and local level is to find viable solutions at that nexus, that interface of achieving food security, tackling climate change, and ensuring livelihoods and resilience for smallholder farmers, as well as their families and rural communities more generally. And while it affects every country, its increasing impacts disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people, especially women, girls, and marginalized communities in the developing world. And while developing countries are the most affected by climate change, they are unfortunately the least able to afford its consequences. Currently, 2 billion people in the world are at risk of food insecurity, of which many are among the 570 million smallholder farming households globally. And COVID-19, of course, has only increased the numbers of the food insecure. Now, smallholder farmers provide for over 60% of our food production, but climate change is expected to decrease their production by 30% by mid-century. And in this period, food prices are expected to rise by 20%. Which is a dramatic set of changes that smallholder farmers may not be able to cope with. And due to the COVID pandemic, approximately 1 in 5 farmers remain unable to consume adequate diets, and 58% of farmers saw their income actually reduce. So, as food demand accelerates, the industry is evolving to be an even greater source of employment, food, and nutrition security in these emerging markets, such as across Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. According to the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, 50% of the total share of climate finance should be spent on resilience building and climate adaptation. Estimates predict that if more is not done to help farmers adapt, climate change could reduce those global crop yields by 30% and millions will be pushed further into poverty. So that is why we are speaking about resilience building in food systems. And to deliver on these sustainable development goals, a systemic approach is needed, as nothing ever stands in one silo alone. There is growing evidence that food and agriculture has a key role to play in not just solving SDG 2, which is about zero hunger, but also SDG 1, poverty, SDG 13, climate change, and SDG 8, decent jobs and income, and of course, many more. So this is an interconnected systemic challenge that needs to be fixed. Globally, accelerated action on climate change is needed to avoid catastrophic impacts. And with that food demand expected to grow 59 to 98% by 2050, opportunities for investment and growth in agri-food value chains must also grow with it to achieve equitable, sustainable, and diverse food systems, ones that build that resilience of communities for those who are most vulnerable to climate change, and of course the emerging health threats that are arising. So the business opportunities are quite clear. Digitalization of agricultural services, building climate resilient infrastructure for the continent's fast-growing cities, and many more. And in this session, we will explore how we can effectively collaborate to provide a supportive policy environment to create projects that de-risk investment opportunities in climate adaptation and spur value chain integration in agri-food to increase capacity for greater resilience to shocks and crises. So that is why we are here today. It's a very complicated but super important challenge. And to help us with the discussion, I'm really delighted to be joined by an enormously exciting panel. We have Mariana Vasconcelos, who is co-founder and CEO of AgriSmart and also a tech pioneer of the World Economic Forum. Veronica Scotti, who is chairperson of Public Sector Solutions of Swiss Re. Hanneke Faber, who is global president of Foods and Refreshment at Unilever. And Feike Sijbesma, who is the co-chair of the Global Center of Adaptation and the honorary chair of Royal DSM. So we'll be discussing a lot of these opportunities and practical business cases to respond to that triple threat of food security, economic and climate crises, and how to build climate resilient food systems in emerging markets. If you're watching, please do submit any questions that you might have about this discussion in the chat through the session, and we'll try to get around to answering them towards the end. And last, but by no means least, there will also be a Meet the Expert session at the end of this 55 minutes or so, where you'll be able to hop into a more personalized space to ask questions to other climate leaders alongside this panel. So without further ado, let us go to our first speaker, Mariana. Mariana, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, you're a daughter of farmers. You're a co-founder and CEO at AgriSmart. As I mentioned, a tech pioneer company of the World Economic Forum. You've got business development degrees from UNIFEI, UCLA, Singularity University. You were nominated the MIT Technology Review Innovators Under 35 Prize, the Forbes Under 30 and Fast Company 100 Most Creative Innovator. You're a global ambassador for Food for Thought. You're an expert in digital agriculture. And no least, you're considered one of the 100 most influential agribusiness people by Dinheiro Rural magazine. So I don't know if you knew that you had all of those accolades at your disposal, but you surely do. And you're probably the best person that we could talk to set off this discussion today. So as an incredibly influential innovator, as someone who can see much of the years ahead of us into this new domain of climate resilience, food security, and such like, how do you feel we can find best ways, practical ways, to tackle that triple threat of COVID, food security, and the economic and climate crisis? Maybe you have some examples or innovations that you've been working on which you could share with us. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic. Sure, it would be a pleasure to share that with you. Well, as we just said, I'm daughter of farmers, so I grew up very closely to that daily challenge of decision-making in the fields, on how farmers rely on their intuition and their neighbors in order to decide what to do. And they're being pushed by the whole society to adapt, right? Like there is a need for increase of production, so they need to be more efficient and find new ways of doing things. At the same time, they need to adapt to climate change and make better use of resources such as land and water, and at the same time be more transparent. I'm sure we're going to discuss that further today. So like farmers really are like in the middle of everything, and what do they do? And that's where technology comes in place. There's a huge opportunity of using data to allow farmers to overcome those challenges. So in our use cases, for example, we do monitor crops with sensors and imagery, and we help farmers in the day-to-day decisions on how to irrigate better and save up to 60% of water, 40% of energy costs, and increase yield. That also means avoid carbon emissions. We help farmers to forecast diseases, and with that, they can adapt their spraying calendar and reduce the incidence of the disease. At the same time, they use less inputs, and they can plan their whole operation. But we really understood that if we want to change farmer, we need to engage the whole supply chain. because farmers are a piece of that. And there is many challenges for us to overcome the scalability of those different techs, so farmers can use them at this full capacity. And the three major fronts in there is infrastructure. The majority of the farms is still in emerging countries and in Latin America do not have internet. So like how farmers will use digital tools in order to have data to support their decisions. So that's a main challenge where I see a lot of debate between government and private sector, but very few advancements on how we can solve that. The second point would be education. There is a huge cost on educating the farmers, first around the awareness on what needs to change, what are they doing that could be done better. And in that sense, the pandemic was a push into the digital transformation, like the whole supply chain suddenly had to adapt on how they would communicate, on how would they buy inputs, on how they would visit their farms, as many of them have different farms in different regions, and immigrants' work were limited. A lot of people understood that they needed more than ever to have technology so they could evaluate things remotely and substitute some labor in order to adapt to the new scenario. But at education, like, it's not only about on how they need to increase yield, on how climate is changing is affecting their production, but also how to make the change of the behavior and operations. So it comes a management piece in there. Like, it's not enough to just buy a technology. They need to change behavior. They need to train everyone within the farm in order to change. And that's a work that we need collaboration with. Like, we as a startup came doing it for almost 7 years now. And from the beginning, it was just us in that dialogue. And now more and more we see the engagement of the stakeholders. And that's where also the food companies can play a very important role on helping us to educate those farmers on how to use those technologies and provide technical assistance, because that's the only way we will address the need we have for climate adaptation and production developments. And the last one will be financial access. It's also very hard to finance new tech for farmers. Like credit, it's already not enough for everyone for costing their production. But we need financing to transition into a new model of agriculture. If you want to scale regenerative, integration between forests and cattle and crops, we need financing so farmers can access those technologies and achieve the cost for that transitioning. And that's still very challenging. So when we look today, like in Latin America, there is a boom of transformation and farmers are already aware and they want to adopt tech, but we need the engagement of the supply chain to make it in scale and make it accessible, especially to smallholders. Because if smallholders are not plugged into a network, it's very expensive and hard to access them individually and make sure that they're not left behind in that transformation.
Mariana, that was just wonderful. I mean, you've really set the stage there, not only in terms of some of the topic areas, but some of the practical arenas that you're working on. That comment that you made, that with your work, you're through technologies and other forms of system innovation, you're helping farmers save 60% of water and 40% of energy costs, is a really material kind of benefit. And then talking about the need for access to the internet, the need for education and awareness, the need to kind of work across the whole supply chain and get it ready to be able to adapt, not just to climate, but to these new health threats and other challenges, the management issues, and then the finance. It's so hard to find the financial products and services to do the work that you're doing, even though it's so vital, not only on the small level, but at scale across the supply chain and to plug into smallholder farmers. Thank you for all that you're doing. I'm going to come back to you because you've teed up so many very interesting questions and challenges, but it's the perfect segue to bring in Veronica Scotti. Veronica was appointed chairperson of Swiss Re Public Sector Solutions in July 2018, following her tenure as Swiss Re president and CEO of Canada and the English Caribbean. Veronica, you joined Swiss Re in 1999, I understand, gaining experience in asset management, strategy, risk management, and alternative risk transfer products, which for those of us outside the financial sector all sound terribly complicated, but incredibly important. Since 2009, you've held various client-facing positions in Switzerland and in the US, and you've got global responsibility for some of Swiss Re's largest multinational clients. Veronica, we're so delighted with the leadership that Swiss Re is showing in the climate space. Your CEO, Christian Mumenthaler, is, of course, the co-chair of our Climate Leaders Alliance here at the World Economic Forum. But Veronica, perhaps just listening to what Mariana was saying, there's very interesting angles in there on finance that you might want to pick up on and tell us a little bit about not only the challenges, but also some of the innovations or opportunities that might be in how we tackle food security, climate resilience, and this, what looks like quite a complicated area. Veronica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dominic, and just again, thanks to Royal DSM for putting together this event. Is incredibly important. I love the passion from Mariana, so I guess that's one personality trait that we share. And I want to pick on the last comment she made about the transition risk, and why would a company like Swiss Re look at the food security as a fundamental business priority. Indeed, as you highlighted, we're very close to discussions around climate and climate risk developments as part of our risk expertise. And just to quote back Dominic, something for the audience, the World Economic Forum put together the Nature Net Zero consultation report, and what it indicates is that by 2050, approximately 1 billion people will live in countries where they have no resilience to deal with expected climate-related ecological changes. So this is a very scary, it's no longer just a food issue, this starts becoming a security issue. Our own research institute very recently published the Economics of Climate Change report, and it calculated again that by 2050, the world will stand to lose 10% of its economic value from climate change. And obviously, in that, transition risk is extremely high. I will just use another quick quote, and then I'll address your question. We also put together a biodiversity and ecosystem services analysis and a tool that we've deployed now in our tech platform that is distributed to over 15,000 risk professionals around the world. And what it does, it allows us to look at the dependence of all sectors of the economy. But in the case of agri-sector, of course, the shocks to the biodiversity and ecosystems are particularly severe. And if you take, for instance, South Africa or Australia, they are the top ranking countries from a fragility standpoint when it comes to their biodiversity systems. Water scarcity is obviously also an important driver alongside coastal protection and pollination. So why does this all matter? It matters because even in the point I want to get across is that today the discussion is about emerging markets, but we all stand to lose from not taking immediate action on the food security and food system reengineering, if you will, reinvention, as Mariana was illustrating. Even in Europe, we will see 9 billion in economic losses, mainly from the damage to the agricultural sector. So I think my first message is this is a call to action. This is not someone else's problem, it's everyone's problem. And we really live it within Swiss Re with that sense of urgency. And in that spirit, we need to make sure that the answers are fair across the entire system. So with an equitable, transparent distribution across the value chain. And we believe that as a financial industry, we have a very important role to play. We cannot wait for the next 10 years for the outcome of that transition risk that Mariana very pointedly highlighted for us until it is again very clear to us how to underwrite these risks. I think this is the moment where the industry needs to be part of the solution. And because we have a number of critical expertise, whether it is in the climate risk area, whether it is in the current analysis of the agricultural sector risks that we already have been underwriting for hundreds of years, and also we're experts on sustainability. So I think this expertise needs to just be utilized very differently with an intent to connect much more across sectors and as Mariana highlighted, a need to retransform together the value chain of the food sector for impact. And an example that I can give in that direction, and again, chapeau to Feike for launching it, in Europe, within European Green Deal, under that agenda, we've created the web-facilitated CEO action group for the European Green Deal. And there is a lighthouse project where I'm personally involved, which is very recently been announced, which is the EU Carbon plus Farming Coalition. And that work is a fantastic example of how we can, through mission possibles approaches, look at making a big transformation at scale. So I'll be happy to go into any aspects of the risk expertise, climate, or agriculture, but maybe I pause it here so we hear more from the other experts.
Veronica, thank you so much. And it was really, really interesting to see you place what some people might assume to be a site-specific emerging economy agricultural challenge into the global picture, not just for the financial community, but for us, for all of us, in terms of the risks that we supply chains, food supply. Now, remind us again, you had some important analysis from Swiss Re, and I'm not sure our listeners entirely picked it up, that by 2050, a proportion of the world's GDP might be affected by climate change. What was the number?
10%. So 10% into 10% of the total economic value of the world will disappear due to climate change if we do not adapt. So we really have an incredible impact, Dominic. And obviously, we publish now for 4 years in the row, resilience analysis across countries, and next study is coming out in less than, I think, a month. And it is said, in fact, I have to say, that obviously COVID has played into that, but we entered 10 years ago with diminished resilience, and things are getting worse and worse. So our financial capability collectively to address this issue is diminished. But this is my word of hope, because I'm a very positive person. I truly believe by joining forces and looking at a system change together, we can make huge differences. And you cited the work that the Climate Leaders Initiative has promoted. We know that the cost of adaptation and change for a lower carbon footprint, more inclusive, more economically sustainable and SDG compliant world is anything between 4 and 10%. We can do it.
God, that's so interesting, Veronica. And we're building a picture up here now. We got from Mariana a very sort of on the ground perspective of some of those challenges. Even though she sketched importantly how it relates to broader supply chains, you've given us, if you like, the big picture, the world view, and some pretty hairy numbers if we don't, but some optimism if we do. And I know that Swiss Re and others, you've been in the lead of shifting many aspects of the financial system, which perhaps some of the viewers might not recognize, but there's all sorts of interesting things, a net zero asset owners alliance, a net zero banking alliance, and the soon to be formed net zero insurance alliance, all part of a big effort to have a net zero financing alliance by the time of the Glasgow COP. And there's an enormous amount of financial institutions involved in that. So maybe some of the plates are starting to shift, but maybe this is where Hanneke, we can bring you in, Hanneke Faber, from Unilever. You joined Unilever in January 2018, I understand, as President of Europe and member of Unilever Executive. That's a pretty important role, in charge of Unilever across Europe. You're delivering strong results and accelerating the digitization of Unilever's European business. You spent most of your career in the fast-moving consumer goods and retail industry. Prior to joining Unilever, you worked at Royal Ahold Delhaize as Chief E-commerce and Innovation Officer, and as a member of the Executive Committee with a key role in accelerating the company's e-commerce business. And between 2013 and 2016, you were Chief Commercial Officer and member of the Exec Committee of Royal Ahold, responsible for all of those things: e-commerce, digital, innovation, customer branding. This is perfect, because we can sense here it's not just the finance, there's a whole innovation, digitization, new tech evolution, transformation that is going to have to occur. We heard from, on the field level, if you like, and at the global level. But also, you've been building some pretty practical efforts on climate adaptation with Unilever, and in particular around India and aspects there. So maybe, Hanneke, you could sort of set the scene for us from Unilever's approach to this as a leading company in the space, and any other issues around that innovation agenda that you think are worth drawing attention to. Hanneke, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic, and thanks for having me here today. Talk a little bit about what Unilever is doing in the space that Veronica and Mariana already talked about so eloquently. I wanted to just touch on, what is Unilever doing? So let me start from the fact that as a big player in the foods industry, we believe we have a responsibility to help build this climate resilient global food system that you all talked about. And the first thing we've done to that end is made an extensive set of public commitments, and you can find all the details of that online. But the commitments really cover all the areas that we're talking about today, including climate and nature, where we're committing to net zero emissions from all our products by 2039, so 11 years ahead of the Paris agreements. We're committing there to a deforestation-free supply chain by 2023. We've just deployed a new regenerative agriculture principles code for all our suppliers. And we've also announced that our brands are going to invest 1 billion euros in a new climate and nature fund. So climate and nature, very much on the front line. We've also made commitments in the area of equitable and inclusive societies. And that includes a really scary commitment of ensuring that everyone who provides goods and services to us earns at least a living wage by 2030. We don't know how to do that today. Of course, the people that work directly for Unilever earn a living wage, but all those smallholder farmers, many of them don't. So that's a huge commitment. And finally, we've made some specific commitments in the food space, including selling 1 billion euros in plant-based foods in 5 years, reducing food waste by half, doubling the number of products we sell that have positive nutrition. You can find all these online, but I think the point is making public commitments is important because that means all of you can hold our feet to the fire. But making commitments is the easy part. Delivering on those is much harder. So what I wanted to just do today is share one example that ties a lot of these things together on the ground. So if you can go to the next slide, I want to talk about tomatoes Unilever in India. What's interesting is that India produces a lot of tomatoes. It's the #2 tomato growing country in the world. But the yield is low on average. The quality is inconsistent, often linked to seasonal effects like the monsoon. And only 2% of Indian tomatoes are processed into paste or something else versus 21% globally. So there's a lot of waste in India as well, tomatoes that never make it to the consumer's house. At the same time, farmers' incomes are often low. And finally, as Unilever, we need a lot of tomatoes for products like I'm shown here on the slide, Knorr soups, Kissan tomato sauces, ketchups. We need a lot of tomatoes, so that's in our interest. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to share the example of Sijbesma Farms and Unilever. Our journey with Sijbesma Farms started in 2018. We were looking for a new processing plant in the west of India because up to then we'd had only one site, which India is a very big country. Meant we had very high distribution costs. And at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we drove better quality tomatoes, more sustainable sourcing practices, and living wages for those farmers. Now, we found Sijbesma Farms. They already existed. I think they were formed in 2011. They're a 100% farmer-owned and operated cooperative with more than 10,000 farmers that grow a variety of crops, but very much tomatoes are part of those. And the site that you see in the picture here spans about 45 acres, and it includes tomatoes, grapes, bananas, some other fruits. Now, the idea that we came up with together was to build a Unilever ketchup and jam plant at Sijbesma's farms facility. And literally, we taught the farmers how to run and maintain the machines. We then also decided that we'd use their existing tomato paste plant, which they already had, which was underutilized, and sourced the paste from them as well. We started in 2019. We also started working with an NGO called ILRT to study the villages from where the tomatoes were coming to understand the needs of the farmers in the same way that Mariana talked about. And with those insights, we're now further supporting farmers with education and digital methods on improved agricultural practices. And for example, that includes seed varietals so we can improve yield and the color, which is really important for tomatoes as well. And you see the results at the bottom of this chart, which we're just super excited about. You see that the yield's gone up, farmers' incomes have gone up, and the quality has gone up. So really a real win-win-win from working together in a way that we hadn't done before, by actually putting a plant on the farmer co-op site. And if you go to the last slide, and I'll wrap it up here, we feel this type of relationship is really a win-win-win as we address the triple threat of food security, economic, and climate crises. So for the farmers, there's improved yield, and we're improving it as we go. There's better income, and they're being upskilled on agricultural practices, including sustainable practices. For their co-op, Sijbesma Farms, there is guaranteed demand, which is so important to run a good business from Hindustan Unilever, which means they can also focus again on teaching those sustainable practices to their farmer members. And for us at Hindustan Unilever, we have an assured and higher quality supply at scale. We have distribution cost savings because we're now in both sides of India. And we can deliver on those commitments that I talked about right at the start. So we love this kind of cooperation. We're looking at expanding it in India, but also to other crops and to other regions. So I'll wrap it up there, but hopefully that gives you, quite a practical example of how a company might address this triple threat.
Hanneke, that's just brilliant. And that practical example is sort of those sorts of things that everyone is kind of looking for to put ideas into practice, and the results are outstanding. And who'd have known? I certainly didn't know that India was the world's second biggest grower of tomatoes. So there's something. I can only imagine, Hanneke, how many meetings and discussions and kind of strategy moments there were to convince whoever it might needed to be convinced that this was going to be a good idea, because those collaborations and partnerships and innovation and the financing, it's not an easy thing to do. Did Unilever find it quite a journey to get to crystallize that project? And now it exists. Is it easier to do more because there's an example of how it can work? It goes back to Mariana's point, I think, about the difficulty of making these things work at scale, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, I think this is where our commitments on climate, on living wage, and on food have helped. Because we made those publicly, the people in our businesses around the world feel the pressure. They got to find ways to deliver on these, which then leads to innovation and maybe a bit more risk-taking than we might have done in the past. So in the past, we would have just built our own tomato plant somewhere in the west of India. But because we didn't just need another plant, we also needed to deliver on these public commitments. The team got more creative and found Sijbesma Farms and came up with a different proposal from what we would have done in the past. So all these things work together. So I would encourage anyone to find ways to make your teams around the world more creative in the kind of collaboration and supply chain solutions that they're looking for. But certainly, we talked about it, but we said, hey, this sounds like it could be a win-win-win. Let's try it. And it's turned out so far to be just that. And again, we're looking for some other ones. So I'm looking forward to hearing Feike talk about AIF because that's another really interesting example.
Hanneke, thank you so much. That's so insightful. And for all of those of you who are watching who are saying, oh, yeah, these companies, they make commitments, but what's the point? It's actually about real results on the ground. There you have it in terms of it's not just kind of those meetings to unlock finance or technology. The driver that a publicly stated commitment can create forces innovation as well and new ideas. And so these things join up. It was a super interesting insight, Hanneke. Thank you so much. You mentioned Feike. Let's bring Feike in. Feike Sijbesma, you're no stranger to this topic today. You co-chair the rather excitingly sounding Global Center for Adaptation, together with Ban Ki-moon, who of course was the former Secretary General of the United Nations. You're also a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum and therefore kind of my boss. So I better ask you some gentle questions today. You're the honorary chairman of Royal DSM. You served as CEO for 13 years in charge of DSM. You chair the board of Royal Philips, and you're a member of the supervisory board of Unilever and the Dutch Central Bank. You're overall a very well-known and very well-respected advocate for businesses to tackle climate change, wearing many hats in several roles. You're the co-chair of the CEO Climate Leaders Alliance of the World Economic Forum. You're a Race to Zero ambassador for COP26. And you're also steering the expansion of Africa Improved Foods, which is addressing malnutrition and hunger by building resilient local food production in Africa. And I suspect we might hear a little bit more of that in your intervention. But Feike, you've heard a fascinating kind of set of perspectives from on the ground, from Mariana, from Veronica in terms of the global financial system, from Hanneke in terms of where a larger corporation is making some headway. But we'd be fascinated in your thoughts and reflections on how we can find practical ways to tackle this quite intricate, complicated triple crisis of food security, the COVID economic crisis, and the climate crisis. Feike, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thanks for your very kind introduction. Really appreciate. Also appreciate the remarks of Mariana, Veronica, and of course Hanneke, who I know very well. And yeah, we are dealing at this moment with the corona crisis, but if I look to Africa or areas where hunger is severe, dealing already for a while also with a climate crisis, a locust crisis, and therefore a food production crisis, just not enough food. And like David Beasley said, and my successor Geraldine mentioned that recently also, there is a vaccine for a shortage of food or for hunger, and that is food itself. And we need to tackle that. 1 billion people in Africa, about 50% is suffering, being stunted or having malnutrition or hunger or whatever, a half of the population. And Africa, which could be an agricultural, this basically continent, but still importing more than $40 billion on food and agriculture products every year, and still 50% of the population which is not well fed. So a big problem. And next to all the food help, which DSM also contributed to that via the World Food Programme, via others, which is great, USAID, etc. But the final solution for Africa or India or other Bangladesh or whatever is not only food help, is not only imports, is not only donations, but is making those continents, those areas, those countries self-supporting. And self-supporting, maybe if I look to climate, also in a resilient way, to get the smallholders the right technologies and being able to grow their own food. Resilient to climate change, resilient to locust, but producing enough to cover their own needs. And that is why, next to all the food help DSM has given over the years, DSM started some years ago with a project what we called Africa Improved Foods, which is, and I want to mention that also, very much supported by my two successors, Geraldine Matchet and Dimitri de Vreese. And I'm very proud how much they support all of this. It's a private-public partnership So it's not only companies, but it is also governmental agencies or finance agencies being involved. And we started in one country, Rwanda. Now we're expanding. And what we did, we said we contact all the farmers. We started in Rwanda with 9,000 farmers. Now we have 130,000 farmers. We buy from those smallholders their crops on a continuous basis. That's very important because therefore they have a stable income and start investing in their own area. And we process those crops towards healthy food in a big factory, Kigali, but now we are setting that up in other countries also, making nutritious food, of which almost 2 million people in Rwanda now benefit from, not being stunted anymore. So locally sourced, locally produced for the local population. And that is making them self-supporting and resilient. And we added to that all kind of technologies, help, etc., to the farmers, how to grow their crops better, what kind of technologies, apps, weather forecasts, etc. But also quality, we help them of getting rid of aflatoxins and getting the quality higher by providing technologies, by providing help to them. So making the food also of a higher quality, all kind of aflatoxin test kits, which we provided to the farmers. At the end of the day, we also looked together with President Kagame of Rwanda, is this now really helping? What is it doing? And we asked Chicago University to do a study on that. And the outcome was only this operation have contributed almost 900 million, almost a billion, towards the GDP of Rwanda. Because 130,000 farmers are not living in poverty anymore and have a regular income stream, start investing, etc. Because there's a whole supply chain and a factory which need to be built, which need to be operated, transports, etc., where people find jobs. And a lot of people not being stunted anymore and therefore can live healthy and can contribute to the economic growth of the country. So it's really providing not only food, but also getting countries out of poverty. As we speak, we are now expanding in Ethiopia, we're expanding in Kenya, later on in Nigeria, Zambia, and our dream is to go across the whole continent and to set up such a enterprise private partnership in all countries. And coming one day, 10 years from now or whatever, to the conclusion, hunger in Africa not being resilient to its climate change is so 2021 and that is done. I hope we come to that point. We need to have the help of governments. We need to have the help of private enterprises. We are at this moment trying to raise 250 million for these expansions in Ethiopia and Kenya, and I hope that other companies or governments will support us here for this expansion. And I think this is only one example, but it is a scalable example, and that for us is important. And it is a local activity to make Africa resilient and self-supporting. And in my view, this is the way to go. And at the end of the day, the West will also benefit from that Africa will be self-supporting. An example, Dominic, and to the others, and some of you know the initiative a little bit more, but I think it is important to take those initiatives. And once again, also very much that Geraldine and Dimitri also support me on continuing this.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. It's a brilliant initiative, Africa Improved Foods. Go and look it up on the internet. You'll find out all about it. For those of you listening now, you've had it's been like kind of 3 PhDs all at once, plus some more in terms of MBAs and innovation and scale up. There's a little kind of red question mark on the right-hand side of your screens at the top. If you want to ask questions, you click on that and you'll get some questions coming through. We've already got some questions coming in, but while you might be thinking of one or two, Feike, if I could just ask you a quick follow-up, if I may. You move in the circuits with former secretary generals of the United Nations, with leaders from international organizations. You mentioned the head of the World Food Programme, with governments and heads of state and other leading chairmen and chairwomen, business people. Do you sense that there is an understanding of how to make this collaboration work at that level that can make things happen to get action down to Mariana and where she's at? Or are we still in a sort of, we're beginning to understand the problem phase? Where do you sense the world is at, given how you can see things and the influence that you have and the people that you mix with?
Well, it's a good question, and I think we are progressing, but we are not yet there. A lot of countries, from their development aid, give noble food help, and we have sometimes struggling with that in Africa, Improved Foods, because they provide access of agriculture products from the West, supported by development aid, into Africa. And that's very cheap. And then my farmers get into problems because they cannot compete against that one yet. Now, we support them as DSM and continue buying. And sometimes I discuss with developed countries, please, it's very noble, I understand it. But let's target the food help in such a way that it is not prohibiting Africa to become self-supporting. Because at the end of the day, that is what is needed. And I think in that sense, this whole private-public partnership and collaboration can become stronger, and also the understanding of making the continent self-supporting.
Very, very interesting insight, Feike. Thank you so much. Mariana, if I can come back to you, you've heard a pretty interesting set of reflections from your other panelists, and we have had a couple of questions come in, and the one that I think might resonate with you, and it's a very good question. It's like, okay, so I understand all of these issues and challenges, but fundamentally, isn't it about a lack of land rights for women, or the role of women in the agricultural space, because they do an awful lot of the burden carrying for this, and how do we envisage that problem being solved? Is this something that that you see and you work with? And from that, maybe there are any other reflections from what our panelists have been mentioning that you'd like to pick up on. Mariana, over to you.
Well, sure. I think gender equality is an issue within farming, like as the majority of the population has been male in the majority of the countries. But it is a little bit different, where in many communities, the women are the one leading agriculture. And I see a big shift from when it was before. And now women gaining more space, becoming farmers themselves, or taking over the business and building networks. I think that's very important. Like when I see Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, we all have like those networks of women in farming, and to exchange experience and empower other women to go up and take their position into that change. And we actually think that women can be a very strategic channel to educate and to canalize technology, because at many times they act as a bundle, like as a connection point between many of their community, and they have this way, like I think we women, we put love in what we do, and we have this caring way that is easier for us sometimes to break some barriers, to change and to communicate. So I think the role of women to digital transformation is very important. And the more women we have, and I'm really happy to see fellow women in these panels, the more women we have, the more we can advance. And if I can add just one comment to everyone's case, I feel really happy to see all those corporate commitments, because I think that's the first step that sets up the tone for change. And when they do it, then people say, okay, that's serious. And that's what we see, for example, with the carbon now, right? Like everyone's engagement is like, okay, that's going to happen. And it's really important for equilibrating the risk and return distribution between the farmers. And I would just call for attention on how do we follow up on those commitments, because like how do we avoid it from becoming a greenwashing and just marketing use cases? Because that's what we see. Like I would add to what you asked before, that a lot of things are just use cases, are just diagnosed. Okay, I can do that here, but we are only going to have the impact we need if we do that at scale. So like, how do we avoid that we only stay at the use case in the marketing and actually achieve the scalability and keep up with the metrics on that evolution?
Thank you, Mariana. It was very, very interesting about the kind of network effect of women farmer groups. There sounds to be something incredibly powerful in that, in terms of the scaling and knowledge share. And then this issue about kind of following up and scaling up these commitments. We don't just have marketing case studies, but we have systemic change. And actually, it's fascinating, because one of the viewers watching this asked exactly the same question. It's for Hanneke, but perhaps Veronica, you might want to come in as well after it. So the question for Hanneke, which builds on what Mariana just said, to be honest, is how truly scalable are the approaches like the tomato initiative that you mentioned in India? In a country like India, with tens of millions of low-income smallholders, do we not feel that 20,000 farmers is a little bit of a drop in the ocean? So I wonder, Hanneke, how you would sort of respond to that. And then maybe then Veronica, after that, that takes us to the scaling, perhaps, of some of the financing solutions that you were referring to earlier. Hanneke, I don't know if you would mind tackling that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a great question, because all these use cases are nice, but if they're never scaled, the world isn't going to benefit from them. So with specifically the Sijbesma Farms tomato example, I chose it because it's not a use case. It is at scale. So Unilever is the #1 foods company in India, in that giant country of India. And we now get half of all our tomatoes from Sijbesma Farms. So while, of course, we will never work with every farmer in India, but this is already at scale. And Sijbesma Farms, I think their turnover is approaching 100 million euros. So this is scale. This is not some small program. And as I said, I'd like to get 100% of my tomatoes in India and in a number of other markets from models like this. So this is at scale, but your push is right. I gotta get more things at scale, because we have some use cases around the world, but I want to scale many, many more, which is why this one's inspiring. And again, collaboration is key. You've got to identify the right farmer collaboratives, got to get the right financing in place from some of the people on the call here today, and sometimes also work with other companies in pre-competitive ways to get things done at scale.
Hanneke, thank you. That's a pretty interesting comment about the collaboration at a pre-competitive level to perhaps build the market. Veronica, this question of scale, I think, inevitably takes us back to finance. Is this something that you think that yourselves and colleagues in the financial system are trying to figure out? There are pretty good examples of these collaborative models, but it obviously requires, the juice into the system, not just of the tomatoes, but of the financing. And I wonder what your reflections are on that to help ask and answer the viewer's question.
Thanks, Dominic. And I think I don't think it was a challenge at all. I think it's just a recognition that, we can all try in our own remit and we will do great things, but will it all sum up to something that is proportionate to the challenge? I guess that's the underlying question. So I could have spoken about the 70 transactions we've done in the last 5 years around the world that are directed towards the agricultural sector, which is about 10% of my team's portfolio. So it is there is a lot of excellent examples, and they're not in the social corporate responsibility space. Just for those who don't know, I actually run a business, but I run a business that is at the intersect between developmental agendas. So we go there where we know that there are market issues, and we have to get very, very creative. So I'll give one simple example, but that's why I would say it's not enough. We work on what we call microinsurance, for sure. The very famous intervention with pastoralists in Kenya, deploying remote satellite imagery to help them protect their cattle in case of droughts. And what I love about that example is that we actually pay before the terrain becomes completely dry, so that they don't become impoverished. They don't have to sell their cattle. They can actually get the food that is needed before they have to resort to extreme situations. So the spirit of that is overcome. How do you reach remote populations? A bit, I think Mariana was talking about that, making sure that you're integrating into the local system of delivery and using technology to overcome problems at a price point that is affordable. But most importantly, moving from an ex post intervention to an ex ante intervention. So we build preparedness and prevention. We've taken a completely different approach, for instance, working with governments. And I will give the example of Kazakhstan, where we've actually, with the ministry, we've developed a blockchain solution because agriculture is a critical sector in that country, and it's the number one exporter driver. So, and obviously, it's important both for their own internal security and then for all exchanges with the rest of the world. And there we use both blockchain and again a different technology for moisture deficit index that allows us to pay very early when we have this detection, again on a parametric basis. So I don't want to go into a lot of details. You have the technical expert session, and my colleague Gary Lemke will be able to address any specific question on the technicalities. As I said, there are examples from India, there are examples from Thailand, all over the world. I lead a team, though I want to move ambition at scale. So I think what we need to change is looking at the entire food system and making sure that we intervene on transparency. A critical point is recognizing that the production and the work and the efforts of the farmers needs to be better distributed, because without them, all of us fail out. So how do we do it? I think technology helps, but the work like the Royal DMS on the ground of transferring the best practices is again essential. So to answer your question at system level, we need to connect players that in each and every sector are leading to make sure that then we work across sectors to create the scale and the acceleration and the impact. And that's why I believe in initiatives like the Farm Plus Coalition, Carbon Coalition, because we're not just trying to experiment, but we all respect each other's experimentation, and we try now to create create the markets, for instance, around the carbon sinking that is agriculture. It could be the second largest solution to carbon in the world, but for that we have to join up. And as a financier, we need to be exposed to how we design this system and make sure we put the risk and the capital required behind it to allow it to take off as quickly as possible and as equitably as possible.
That was brilliant. I'm sorry, we're a little bit running out of time. I know that there's loads of people listening to you taking furious notes because the insight that you're providing is incredible. And in the middle of all of that, you've actually rather brilliantly answered a question which came through about what Swiss Re is doing in practice to help smallholder farmers in developing countries. And you said, you've got over 70 projects and activities in your portfolio, 10% of your activity in the space. For those of you who are watching, don't go away. We're coming to the end of this section, but then there will be a Meet the Experts room where you can join. But I would just like to, for the final reflect, Feike, just come back to you. From what you've heard from your fellow panelists and the flavors of the conversation, a couple of lines to leave with our audience listening to this. Feike.
Yeah, first of all, very much appreciate and Veronica, Mariana, Hanneke, you, Dominic. We need a system change, but the advantage is we can enforce a system change together, and we need that. And one of the most important things, and Veronica mentioned it also from Swiss Re, is the struggle that local farmers have with the volatility of the price, of the volume, and how they can deal. And then they will not grow, they will not develop, etc. And what we've seen here is examples, and I see also collaboration maybe with AIF and Unilever or Swiss Re or others on reducing the volatility for the farmers, getting their a more stable income, and therefore also change the narrative on the ground. And I've been very excited that I see those opportunities. And that makes us really to a resilient system for climate change, but also against all the volatility and fluctuations. Very much appreciated this session.
Feike, thank you so much for those closing remarks. And thank you, audience, for watching it. I hope that there were plenty doing kind of MSCs, PhDs, undergraduate degrees in agriculture, adaptation, climate resilience, finance, smallholders, global supply chains, technology innovation, and women's networks for substantial change, because all of that was covered in this session. It was a really, really interesting and informative discussion. Don't go away, because if you have some burning questions to ask or ideas to propose, the next piece which you can head over to is called Meet the Experts. And there's a room, if you follow the link that you can see on your screen, to continue this conversation with some of the experts in the field who are actually doing some of the things that we've just been hearing about. And also, if you enjoyed this session, we warmly welcome you to the Sustainable Development Goals tent community for more of these conversations moving forward. And you can visit www.businessforsdgs.com to sign up to be informed on future events in the tent. A big thanks to Royal DSM and all of the other partners of the SDG tent, and to Mariana and Veronica and Hanneke and Feike for a brilliant conversation. I was Dominic Waughray from the World Economic Forum, and with that, we'll close this discussion. Don't go away, transfer yourselves to the expert room. But thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.